Hello, so here's an introduction to the VR Design Challenge Part 0, which you have completed. So that was something where you had to essentially recreate an existing experience, study recreated, known from 3D applications games or even existing VR experiences. The key thing here was to have foreground, midground, background, and later we want to be able to travel in this world, and then we want to select things and we want to manipulate, so move things around, for example, or turn on the light on and off and things like that. We want to try to design for VR, so we should pay attention to scale and we should potentially explore things like perspective and other things. So anyway, I linked an example here that I think is very good. So this is Alyssa Downs from 2021, and she created this Play Planets experience or recreated it. Used Unity and Blender, so I actually did some 3D modeling. You're always allowed to learn new things. In fact, you're encouraged. This is not a course where I teach you how to do everything in Unity, and I think this is something that is should be seen as a positive challenge, but it can probably also lead to some frustration. So there's a little bit of a problem statement here, a little bit of a discussion of what the concept is about the game. So it's kind of like actually at this time, the AR and VR prototypes were really like mini projects. They were not design challenges, they were mini projects. So that's why it's a bit more detailed and you don't have to have all this. But Alyssa really thought this through, and you can think about how the flow should work. Here's a little bit of a prototype video from a 360. With the 360, starting with the 360 is pretty cool, and just really seeing some of the work, and then doing a diorama with Play-Doh. And what I like about this is now we're starting to think about the interactions and the locomotion and the depth of things and which objects should be pickable. What are the main characters in the scene? These are things that you don't really see so well in a 360. What do we want to be able to move around and stuff like that? Where is animal feeding happening? There's lots of really cool ideas. In many ways, this is definitely exceeding expectations. There's a lot of the same types of interactions, like interacting with animals, but all kinds of cute little different animals. So I think a small subset of this would be sufficient for our current goals. Here is a digital prototype work in progress.
Hello, I'm going to be taking you through my first iteration.
Yeah, first iteration, as she says. And so we're going to translate this 360 and Play-Doh into kind of like a Unity scene. You can see it here. Interesting to have these controllers here and have a little bit of fake movement with the mouse and WASD and player controls. This is something that I guess Alyssa looked up, and maybe also something that was easily available in the tools. There might be some video overlays going on here. This seemed like uh, a little video editing, and but this is allowed. This filling the gaps, and now we can actually fly around and yeah, experience the different scenes. This was actually an interaction that I don't think we have seen before in, at least I hadn't seen it before in a physical prototype, but there should be some relationship to the physical prototype. The final digital prototype here is this. It has like kind of like still this cool play planets idea. Again, translating some of the key interactions, selecting which ones to focus on, picking objects and moving them. Um, this is really high fidelity. It's definitely not demonstrated in VR and not actually on a headset. There's a lot of um, kind of like fake interactions here, but it's done in a very convincing um, manner. It's definitely tedious, but very detailed work. And but so in many ways, this is a portfolio project. So this are probably just like really they made it a project because they had, I think, one more week than us at the time. They didn't have much more training in VR, and to be honest, in Unity. And to be honest, at the time, Unity was a lot harder than it is now with building blocks, etc. But still, she talks about this also like It's difficult to code interactions in Unity. I developed a prototype for how the navigation in the game would work. It was my first time designing a mostly diegetic navigation, so like story based within the 3D scene, though I still use the menu for one screen. Also, what I like is like how she's using the language from the course. So this is really this is excellent work, demonstrates, understands the concepts, can get around in Unity and fill the gaps with other tools like physical prototyping or video editing. Anyway, so at this point you should have a 3D scene and you're thinking about locomotion. And so locomotion as a form of travel, getting around. This is not the same for all the scenes. Also, this design challenge comes in two parts. We're basically doing a V1 and a V2. A V1 is kind of like a lo-fi. And the lo-fi really depends, and the hi-fi really depends, like how hard you go in in the V1. So low fidelity doesn't mean it looks crap. It just means that maybe there is less detail at the moment. I still have to use more imagination. For the lo-fi prototype, it could mean that it could actually mean that our first use. Let's say one of the students created this really cool scene, like a Zen garden, and a Zen garden kind of like has something magical, mystical to it. It's just like a recreational space, potentially calming, soothing, and those kinds of things. So going in there with meta building blocks and jumping around with some of the teleportation techniques could be a V1, but I don't think this is what we want because it doesn't really fit the theme there. And so what I tried to explain in class is like how to think about low fidelity and high fidelity prototyping, and that it's not about demonstrating that you can use meta building blocks in Unity. We did this in the workshop, so obviously everybody can now apply it to their project. There is relatively little transfer if you just implement that in your project, and that is not the goal of 559. The goal of 559 is to learn what kinds of things are available and we need to think about. So that is travel, selection, and manipulation. These are three important goals we want to support in our virtual reality, in our virtual world that we have created. And so in part one, we do a first attempt. We prototype 2 to 3 interactions using the things we learned even in the AR portion now, or maybe using a tool like Unity. But similar to Strata and Unity, you can actually also define states. You would do this with objects groups that you show and hide. Transitions between these states, you don't have the fancy hotspots like what Jingle implemented, but you can fake, as we often like to say in this class, fake the interactions. But I don't think there's anything fake about it. This class is about finding the fastest and shortest path to the experience. But if you have, so likewise, it shouldn't be that you do something with animations now and then next week you're going to use meta building blocks. This meta building blocks, the interactions that they have there are useful for picking up things, throwing things, a little bit of locomotion. But really think about your experience. Like, I mean, in the Detroit Zoo example that I showed in class, we really had different ways of navigating. And I can try to find this. So, for example, here, we in lecture 6 we talked about the zoo, and I showed a lot of different things. So I showed how locomotion works, walking works. In the zoo we actually had different ways to navigate to the different scenes, and for example this was menu based, and so this is kind of like coming to a zoo. The metaphor here is not very VR. This is really like a menu. This is non-diegetic, it feels. The diegetic way would be like you're seeing a pole with all these directions. In this direction, 500 meters, you can see the African forest. In this other direction, you can see that. But I think we decided against it because it would be a bit harder to select, but it would have been closer to reality. Anyway, and then when you go and pick one, and we have colliders and all that stuff, you can basically click these and then it takes you there. But it's different from teleporting around. Also, I don't want to have this zoo. I mean, we did have teleportation, so we could go closer and inspect, but then you can pick these things and it takes you to the specific animal scene. And then the idea is to walk a little bit around, and it's actually interesting where you put that navigating back sign, which is like this one here. So the idea was that you get to experience a little bit like these animals and have them look at you, and then depending on what your story, what you want people to do, where you place this navigating back sign is really, really important. Depending on, so this is actually what I want you to think about. Not necessarily, oh, how do I implement this in Unity that when I click this, I can go there. It's more like, what's the right way of traveling in the scene? What kinds of objects should actually be selectable? And what should you be able to do with them? Here, for example, we decided that we can select the bananas, manipulate them, give them to the monkeys, and actually have this kind of interaction. I should probably not use my torchlight to pick up these objects. I should have used the other hand. But in any case, I'm just demonstrating how this works here. It looks like a little low fidelity here. Obviously, it has colliders for debugging and stuff like that, because it's, the idea of this video was to demonstrate to our learners in this online course what actually happens when you do this kind of manipulation and how these objects are actually interactable. But in any case, I just wanted to be clear, okay, which of the objects in the scene should be selectable? Are the monkeys selectable? Are the bananas selectable? What does this yellow thing here actually do? Is this like a really big, what is this actually that we're feeding here? Is this a placeholder for some other content? What types of interactions do you want the user to be able to do? Where are the interactable objects? And so not everything you put in the scene is interactable. We talked about this. So that's what I want you to figure out. Not necessarily how do I implement a distance grab or a throwable item interaction in Unity. It can help, and it could be something for your V2 if you really feel like this really takes it. It actually would reduce the level of imagination, but it might still not be what you really imagine for your final version. In any case, so that's the idea of the assignment, and I want to say that it is structured in two versions, but the instructions are the same. So the due date for the V1 is next week, and the due date for the V2 is the week after. And we'll have those also then released on Canvas, so don't be confused. It's just a way of reducing the amount of documents and content we share with you. Yeah, when you demonstrate your two versions, also like Alyssa did, it makes sense to refer back to the previous version, like showing in the initial video, like this was the starting point. This is what I've been working on, and then I took the 360 that I created in the week before, was here, and the Play-Doh, and now this week I really took some of the elements. There was this airplane actually, and now I took this further. And then here in my next V1, V2, and here's an introduction sequence, which is kind of like cool. Here are some of the interactions I focused on. Prototyping, the feeding was important to me, blah, blah. And now here is like actually the fruit picking scene that I implemented, and petting sheepy and all kinds of cool things. And she put everything together. This is a bit of video-based interaction. I think a prototype and then you go to a different scene which she hasn't prototyped, but this was just with a video overlay. Overall, it really seems like a very complex design concept, and it would need to be refined further. I mean, don't get me wrong, I really like this project, but it is also not perfect, and but it's just fine because it was done under a time limit. Excellent work. I'm sure this was a good grade too, and you can aim for something like this, but it's just there to show you what is within scope, and maybe also where we overdid it here a little bit. And it's not the exact same course structure, so yeah. I think as a student in this class, I wanted to be designers, not students. A designer doesn't ask what I need to do to get an A+. A designer they have to structure their time into it, and so they can do a deliverable within this time, a meaningful deliverable, something they're not embarrassed by and potentially proud of. And that's how you should think about it. And what you need to demonstrate to us from a grading perspective is that the fidelity has increased, and that you read the instructions, and that you thought about travel, selection, and manipulation. If you end up doing something for your V2 where you experiment with a tool like Unity, for example, you make the jump from Strata to Unity, and now in the V2 for some reason it just looks worse, it just turned out to be worse, than the V of 1, I would still accept that result. Maybe it was just harder to do in Unity. Maybe it is less fake, as we often like to say, but actually also more ugly. And that's an okay learning result. We're not really judging the quality of your prototypes. We're judging the amount of your learning and the degree to which you can defend some of the design decisions, the rationale, the logic that goes into them. And anyway, I'll stop here. I was trying to convey a lot of this in class, but I guess Michael always talks a lot, and here we are 15 minutes later. So good luck with this assignment. It should be a lot of fun. I look forward to seeing your prototypes.